Okay, it looks like we're recording now. So it didn't give me the warning as normal. Okay, so this is the 24th of December 2021, and we're going to try to pick up kind of where we left off. When we left off, you were talking about the war, but we've gone through it very, very quickly. So yeah, I still have questions about, for example, you went to St. Louis or went to Missouri.
Yeah, that's in Columbia, Missouri.
In Columbia,
Okay.
and then from there you got
I was in the hospital with the mumps, and my class had graduated and they had all scattered. I was the only one in my class still left. I was discharged from the hospital, and I was given a travel package that included my service record up to that point. I also had a week's leave coming and a ticket on a train back to Los Angeles. I had a week's leave coming, and so I had my sea bag on my shoulder. I left the hospital with my records, and in my records they gave me a little emblem of a patch, and what it was instead of a fireman's second class, I was now a motor machinist mate's second class, and my pay went up from $66 a month to $96 a month. That's almost double what a recruit was making. I don't know how I got from the campus of the University of Missouri to the train station. This was in Columbia, Missouri. I don't remember how I got there. So I probably took a cab, but I just don't remember. At the train station, I had a ticket for a train that would take me from Columbia to Kansas City, where I would change trains, take the train from Kansas City to Los Angeles. But it was about a 2.5 hour wait for the train. And so with nothing to do, I checked my sea bag in at the station there and just started walking around the town. And then I came across a cleaning shop where they did took in cleaning. They also did alterations on clothing. So I walked in the shop and asked him if he could take the red band off my left sleeve that indicated I was in the engineering division of a ship, and put what's called a crow, because it's an eagle on top with chevrons below it. One chevron is third class, 2 chevrons second class, and 3 chevrons is first class. And he did, he did it. And it took him about 20 minutes. And he got done. I pulled my wallet out. He just held up to his right hand, said no. I says, but you don't know me. You'll never see me again. He says, I've seen enough of you. Thanks for what you're doing. Whatever it is, those weren't the exact words, but anyway, I put my blouse of my uniform back on. I was now a second class petty officer. Okay, I walked back to the train station, and pretty soon I saw a headlight in the distance. Now this was late in the afternoon, and what's the story about Casey and the train?
Oh, I don't remember.
Was a great engineer or something like that, and they named the train in that song something about an express. I forget what it was, but that was the train, because as the train approached, across the front of it, an angle, there were two flags giving the name of the train, and as it went past it, the drive wheels of the train were taller than I was. I was 5'6", and the drivers were way over my head. So these big wheels meant that this was a fast train. I got aboard the train, as was customary during the wartime years. All the seats were taken. So I found an empty spot, set my sea bag down, and I sat on top of my sea bag. At the next stop, pretty soon, some guys got up, picked up their, almost all servicemen on the train, picked up their baggage, carry-ons, and left. I saw one in the corner. So I picked up my sea bag, put it in the corner of the train there, and I was a little more comfortable. And it took us about 2.5 hours to get from Columbia to Kansas City, as I remember it. Okay. Got off the train, and again, there was about an hour and a half wait for the train to Los Angeles. Incidentally, it was the Challenger. I remember that. That was a very reliable train there that was famous for being on time. Eventually, the train arrived, and I spent a cold night. This was mid-spring. Check that. Mid-summer. This was July, but it was kind of cold that night. And I think what happened is during the day the air conditioning was on now, and they didn't turn it off. Okay, pretty looking at the schedule, I knew we were going to be in Denver. I thought Denver would just be a stop, but Denver was going to be an hour and 10 minutes, a 70-minute stop in Denver. Whoops. I have family there. I was born in Denver, and it just occurred to me. I was on the train, couldn't make a phone call. If I would have thought about it, I would have called, or knew about it, I would have called while I was waiting either in Kansas City, but that didn't happen. Anyway, we arrived in Denver, and I didn't want to leave. I think I checked my my sea bag. I must have checked it because I don't remember taking it. And the train got there. I got off and I caught a taxi right away, 1457 Corona Street. And in about less than 15 minutes after we arrived in Denver, I was at Corona Street. I got out, walked up, and knocked on the door, and my Aunt Celia answered. And she looked at me and she kind of blinked, and I don't think she recognized me, or she thought, well, who, he looks familiar, but I can't quite place him. She says, yes. I said, it's Bobby. Everybody called me Bobby. And she looked at me and says, look at the picture, because behind her, sitting on the radio, was a picture. One picture was of Stanley, and the other one was of myself. The two members of the family were in the service. She turned around and looked. She knew who the picture was. Then she caught on. Okay, we had a big greeting and everything. Uncle Dewey and Uncle Jack Jack was Seal's husband. Dewey was Seal's brother, my uncle's. Anyway, she called them. They came home. They took me back to the station. We had a wonderful few minutes, and then pretty soon I was on the station or on the train and off to Los Angeles. I don't remember much about what I did in the week I was at home.
That's okay.
I remember I went. I don't even remember how I went back to San Diego. But anyway, I got back to San Diego, reported to the internal combustion engine school at the at the naval base in San Diego. Then it was called the destroyer base because it originally opened up as a base for West Coast destroyers. I went to the this was also a 3-month school. You learned about diesel engines in general at the University of Missouri, and it's very specific in the internal combustion engine school. The engines that were used in the landing craft at that time, there were 2 of them. One was the Gray Marine 671, which eventually was labeled as a GM engine, and most of GM's engines were based on that in the years to come. And the other one was a Hall-Scott gasoline engine. Both engines had this same comparable power, and we spent almost 3 months taking them apart and putting them together again. When the school was over and I graduated, if you want to call it that, then I went to the amphibious forces in over on Coronado Island, across the bay.
So when you were originally doing the school, was that on the
the internal combustion engine school was on the destroyer base on at the naval it was called the destroyer, the naval station. It was a big station. They a lot of berthing space for big ships. They had a dry docks there, the service ships. It was a busy place then, as most military bases were in those times. At the amphibious school, I was just like any other. For whatever reason, they taught me how to run and the small landing craft. Primarily, one's called an LCVP, landing craft vehicle personnel. That's when it had the ramp in front. You would run up on the beach, and what we had to do was run it up until it was beached. But it wasn't quite that simple, because you have to know what the wind was. You had to keep square with the waves, and sometimes the surf would not be running parallel with the beach, and that actually very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I learned how to operate the single engine LCVP and the multi-engine LCM, these were big all steel landing craft, about 50 feet long, and they could carry a tank and a bunch of men at the same time. With 2 engines, beaching them and backing them off with 2 engines, you have 2 throttles to contend with. By twisting the throttle that was like stepping on the accelerator and then pushing it forward. You went forward, pulling it back, and it would put the reduction gear in reverse. So I learned how to both beach and run back off the beach too. For whatever reason, apparently they thought I was pretty good, because when my class graduated, they all disappeared and I stayed. They kept me there as an instructor on how to run a boat. The thinking behind it never did square with me, and I never did ask, why are you keeping me? Because it's the job I certainly didn't want. But in any event, in the fall of 1940, I was there as part of ship's company from the fall of 1943 until late January or early February of 1945, roughly 16 months.
During that time, you were doing training primarily?
I was teaching guys how to run a boat. Yeah. Okay. And then, of course, the great thing about it was I had 3 out of 4 weekends off. So for most of those weekends, I would go home. It was 146 miles from the destroyer base to my house on 8th Avenue in Limerick Park.
But there was no I-5 at that time, right?
Okay. Most of the time I hitchhiked, incidentally.
Ah.
Yeah, it was easy. It was easy to get rides. It took me sometimes. It's a 2.5 hour drive from the house at that time, and most of the times I made it in 3 hours. Sometimes there were other guys that lived in LA, and either had cars. I had a car, but I didn't want to bring it down there, because if I have a car down there and I get shipped out, what happens to the car? Okay, so I was there until again late February of 45, and I was gone.
Where did you live in San Diego?
Where did I live?
Yeah, where did you live in? Because I was in San Diego for a while, so I'm kind of...
Okay, I lived in the amphibious space.
Okay, you were on the base.
Okay. I was lived on the base. One time I came home from LA on it was a Sunday night, and I walked towards the barracks building where I was birthed, and it was smashed to pieces, the whole building. As a matter of fact, there was a row of them that 2 or 3 of them. The first one had part of the roof damaged. The second one, most of the walls are down, but some walls are up. And on ours, the whole building was pancaked. Okay. And what had happened was a big 4-engine Convair flying boat was practicing nighttime takeoff and landings in San Diego Bay. Now, the amphibious space was a fill-in. They filled in the base the property was on, and it stuck out in the bay a little bit. And what this guy, the pilot, somehow he got disoriented. Instead of landing in the bay, he was about a 1/4 mile off his course, and he set right down on the first building and went right through our building. the plane caught fire, and there was most of the crew died in that base. I lost almost all my possessions, and I'm a little bit unclear as to what happened after that. I think I found my sea bag. We didn't have lockers. We lived out of our sea bag. I think I found my sea bag and most of my possessions, but my mind is a little fuzzy as what happened. It was a shocking thing. That I don't know how many people died in that, but there's also airplane wreckage all around the place. And again, my mind is a little. Maybe the shock of it happened. I didn't get imprinted, and that anyway, my stay at the amphibious base came to an end, and I was gone. We went to Pearl Harbor. I did I tell you about how I saw the ship with the George Clymer, the one Stanley was on? I think we went through that.
Yeah, a little bit, yes.
Okay.
So when you got shipped out, was it to, obviously you weren't going to be training anymore. Were they going to have you, they now wanted you to go back to being a machinist?
What?
When you got shipped out, finally,
Yeah.
this is in January 45, right?
This was in I went to a place in Pearl Harbor. I forget what they call it, where you wait to be assigned to a new station.
Were you going to be doing, were you going to be at that time when they shipped you out, were you going to become a motor machinist again? Like, were you going to be helping out?
Yeah, of course. And that's what happened. They're called a draft. And when you muster every morning, you know what muster is. They call out your name and you're present. So after muster that morning, they call out the name of men for the draft. What happens is a ship or a station or a command somewhere needs a radio man. They might need a seaman first class. They might need a yeoman. They might need a gunner's mate. All of these ratings, there's guys waiting to fill them. Most of them are new recruits, but some of them are men that have served. They are home, they go on leave, and instead of going back to their station, they're waiting for a new station. So anyway, eventually my name was called, and right like that, I went back, packed my sea bag, and I was on a taxi that took me to the Lst 208. And needless to say, it was a little bewildering. I went aboard. I met the chief is in charge. Chief motor machinist mate was in charge of the crew. They had a chief. There was one first class motor machinist mate. Who acted like an executive officer. When the chief wanted something done, he told the first class what to do, and it went down the line. There were two other motor machinists mate, and a bunch of firemen, first class and second class. About a short time after I went aboard, they announced that we're departing for the deck crew to man their lines and all of that. And the chief told me to follow him, and we went down to the engine room. The first time I was in the engine room of an LST, and I could do nothing more than observe what was going on. In the engine room, it's powered by two big General Motors diesels. A lot of piping, a lot of air ducting. Incidentally, engine rooms get hot, so there's a lot of air that's fanned in from intakes up on the main deck, and they're a little bit noisy. And they have what's called a small throttle platform, where there's they have a throttle stand with a throttle on two sides of it, and you just like this, you hold the throttles forward, back, very much like the LCMs. They also had something called Enunciators, and you might have seen it in the movies. They're round indicate they look like the face of a clock, only instead of numbers on them, it'll have stop, 1/3, 2/3, full, flank. You go in one direction for forward and the other direction back, and they have the same thing up in the wheelhouse on the bridge, in the bridge. And when the deck officer who will be in charge of the ship at that time says all forward 1/3 or all back 1/3 or port or starboard, he'll go in increments of 1/3, 2/3, full, flank, etc., etc. And then a seaman operates the Enunciator, which has a little pointer that goes around. When he pushes it, the pointer on our Enunciator follows what he does, and we can see what they say. And there's a chart in front of you that says 1/3 is so many RPMs, 2/3 so many RPMs, etc., etc. So that's how you handle the throttle. In addition to the main engine room, we had an auxiliary engine room too, which was in front of the main engine room. And there were 3 auxiliary diesel-powered generators in the auxiliary engine room. They were powered by a Buddha 4-cylinder diesel engine. They were 100, each one was a 100 kilowatt generator, and it produced DC power. The reason they had DC power on a ship was very much like they have DC power in a car. If you have AC power, you need 2 lines to run anything electrical. You have a positive and negative. In a car, you only have 1 line going to the appliance being powered, and the return is grounded in the car itself. So that's what they had on the ships. The return was the hull of the ship. In port, as I remember, we always had 1 generator running, the 100 kilowatt generator. At sea, we ran on 2 of them. And during I can't think of the term. When there's an emergency, they call all hands on deck, man your battle stations. There's a term for that. I can't even think of. You would know what it is.
I can't think of it right now. I'm not sure what you're saying.
Okay. Okay. And
It's okay.
Okay. And anyway, when that happened, whoever had the watch in the auxiliary engine room, if you were seeing there were two generators running, you had to start the third one and put it online. Now, they had a big electrical board with a rheostat for each generator, and what I had to do when there was one generator running, like when you're tied up in port, it was no problem. But when you had two generators running, you had to share the load equally between the two of them, and that would be called amperage. So you could see on a meter what the total amperage being used at the time, and you had two rheostats you had to turn so that each of the two generators running shared that amperage. It's actually called a load, shared the load. And when you put three of them online, as you went up with the third one you were putting online, you had to go down a little bit on the other two that were already running. So now you share the load on all three of them. Okay, that was the first thing I had to learn. We were going to another part of, we left Pearl Harbor and went to another landing spot that was around Diamond Head, on the other side of Diamond Head, to pick up whatever we picked up there. And during that time, they showed me around the engine room, things that had to be done while it was running. It was somewhat complicated. Then we had to go into the auxiliary engine room, where we did what I was just reiterating. And in addition to that, in the auxiliary engine room, they had a fuel purifier. Now, diesel fuel, as it's refined, is still pretty dirty. And what we had to do is run the diesel fuel that powered the small auxiliary engines and also the main engine, that all had to be purified, filtered with what's called a centrifugal fuel purifier. And I had to learn how to take that apart. We had two of them. While one was running, the other one was cleaned and was ready. And they alternated between the two of them so that you always had something running to purify the fuel. We would draw fuel from the bunker tanks on the ship that were generally near the center of the ship. That was to keep the load balanced. And after the fuel was purified, it went to what's called a day tank. And that went to the engines and fed the main engines and the auxiliary engines.
Question for you. So your primary job when you were on the ship is to run the main engines? Is that, or the auxiliary?
No.
Or okay. I mean, you were trained for the landing, the ship holds.
Okay, the job, anything mechanical on the ship. And we had two LCVPs, two in davits, one on each side of the ship, port and starboard. Whenever we were in harbor or whatever needed the LCVP for, the deck force provided a coxswain for it, and the engineering division provided an engineer for it. So We had that. There was also what they call the had electric motors to operate the davits for the boat. Electric motors, that was part of our job, maintaining and running them. The electrician was responsible for the electrical system on board. We also had a water purification plant, Lst 208, as she was built. Incidentally, she was built by the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company in the fall of 1943. There's a long history on it. I have it somewhere. If I can find it, I'll pull it out. Where were we? Okay. Any electric motor, any electrical circuit, anything mechanical aboard the ship, we were responsible for. And we also had something called a smoke generator. What is a smoke generator? It was like a little furnace with a blower, a leaf blower. Well, if you attach a little furnace to it, supply it with fuel, say on the order of a torch of some kind, it would blow a very rich diet of fuel rich and not much air. You get a lot of smoke. So when we were beached or tied up in areas where there was might have been danger of an attack, we would make smoke, and it would partially hide us and made it difficult for anybody to see us and attack us. Well, we were also responsible for the generating the smoke. I would start the when we had an alert, a general quarters. It's called. That's the term we had that I couldn't think of before. But go up and start the smoke generator. And the problem with the smoke generator was when it was all over, it would leave a residue of smoke. So now the deck force, they had to clean all that up, primarily with a fire hose and pumping seawater all over the decks to wash away the oil residue from the smoke.
Question for you. This ship, how many? Because it holds landing crafts, right? It holds the smaller crafts.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No.
I was just curious how many of those it can hold.
Let me describe an LSD to you. It's a ship. It's not a boat. They were 320 some odd, 325, 328 feet long. They had a 50-foot beam and about a 15-foot draft. Fully loaded, they displaced something like 2,500 to 3,000 tons. The inside of the ship, the forward 2/3 or 3/5 of the ship was called a tank deck. And up front in the bow, there were doors that would open up. The doors would open up like a vertical clamshell, like this. When the doors opened, there was a ramp inside, and the doors were not watertight. They were enough to give the ship some type of smoothness running through the water, but there was a ramp behind the doors, and the ramps were sealed, and they kept out most of the water. What happens? You would run up on the beach. before you ran up on the beach, you would shift ballast water to the stern, and what that did was drive the stern down a short distance and raise the bow, so that you could drive up on the beach. At the bow, the draft might have been as low as 3 or 5 feet. At the stern, it went down to 13 or 14 feet. As the ship would approach a beaching, we had a anchor on the stern of the ship. We would drop the anchor maybe 200, 300 yards off the beach. And the purpose of that was when you left the beach in reverse, you would draw up on the anchor. It wasn't connected to the ship with a chain. It was with a cable, and it had a big reel on it. They were driven by a large electric motor. So as you backed off the beach, you would take the slack out of the cable there, and would keep the ship from broaching. And the term broaching means that instead of being 90 degrees to the beach, you could broach one way or the other and be parallel. If that ever happened, you usually lost the ship. Let's see. So, well, I was talking about where
You're
was
talking about the ship.
Yeah.
I was just curious. I was curious about what it could hold, like how much stuff you could hold in there, and like what you were transporting around.
Okay. When the doors would open and the ramp would come down, then that gave access to the tank deck, which covered roughly 3/5 or 2/3 of the length of the ship. The ship was 50 feet wide, but there were 2 aisles, and the distance from the tank deck to the upper deck was roughly 20 feet, not quite 20, maybe 18 feet. And along the side of the ship, there were on both port and starboard side, there were 2 walls with decks in them. So this gave access when you were on the second deck below the main deck. You had walkways going on both sides of the ship, going from the stern clear up to the bow. And these internal walkways were actually berthing stations for the men that we carried. If we had construction equipment aboard the ship, then there usually would be CBs. We had all the berthing spaces we had room for maybe 150 men, and all those narrow compartments going forward on both sides of the ship. And they also gave access to the engine room and the auxiliary engine room, and also to the stern, to the shaft alleys, where we had to go daily down there and lubricate the main bearings that carried the propeller shaft. They carried big cans of grease, and we had a way of putting a can in a container, and this would inject grease into the it's called a thrust bearing, that took up when the screws spun around there. It put a big strain on the bearings at the end, and they had to be kept lubed. You'd put a can, a 5-pound not 25 pounds, I guess, a can of lube grease in it, and you puncture it by pushing down the lever, then pumping the lever with your foot, injected grease into the shaft's bearing. That was a daily occurrence. Okay. 10 o'clock. You want to go a little?
I can go a little bit. If you want to go a little bit further, or how are you feeling? If you're ready to kind of be done, then that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So a little bit on how an LST operated. We when we left Pearl Harbor, we went west to a big atoll called Enewetak, and Enewetak. Most of the islands in the Central and South Pacific were called atolls, in which they had an island, one, two, maybe three island, and there was a big barrier reef around it. And some of them were enormous. You could literally hold hundreds of ships, and that's what Enewetak was. Because I remember I was in the engine room when we arrived at Enewetak. I was not at sea. We were broken up into 3 watches. You'd serve 4 hours on and 8 hours off, and it would rotate. Your first rotation was like you could go from 8 to 12 in the morning and 8 to 12 at night, or you could go from 12 to 4 at night and then the morning, or 4 to 8. So there was rotation around watches while at sea. When you're in port, it was just port and starboard. There were 2 watches. 2/3 of the men would generally be on liberty, if liberty was available, and 1/3 would be on watch. I was in the engine room, and after we had dropped anchor at an anchorage, and I was off watch, and I went up on deck, it looked like we had anchored in the middle of the ocean. We knew we were in an atoll of some kind, because there were no waves. Water was rippling. It was almost like you're on a big lake in a windy day. And some of my shipmates told me we were just going. They couldn't see where we went through the entrance to the atoll, but you were just going, and all of a sudden you stopped and dropped anchor. What would happen is that we'd lower one of our boats in the water, and a crew would go ashore. They would pick up mail there, and also it was a place where you could get supply. You pick up food, especially fresh food, vegetables, meat. Sometimes we would get equipment that had to be added to or replaced. It was a very complicated system of supply and demand, so to speak. So and they had what was called little lighters, LIGHTERS, fuel lighters, which would come alongside some of the smaller ships and pump diesel into our storage tanks. So that's how we operated. We could run roughly. We had a range of roughly 5,000 miles on one load of diesel fuel. Our storage tanks held about 180,000 gallons of diesel fuel. Enewetak, there was another island. I can't think of the name of it. The third place we went to was Saipan. After Saipan, we went to Guam. We got to Saipan. We lost part of the cargo we were carrying, vehicles. I think it was mostly construction battalions. We dropped some off at Saipan. We picked some more up in Guam, and from Guam we went to Okinawa. That's where we ran our smoke generators during the day. In Okinawa, we started doing exercises of beaching the ship. At the time, of course, we didn't know exactly what was happened, but in particular, but we knew in general, we were training for a landing in Japan itself. We did this for about 10 days in Okinawa, and the last one, the equipment we had aboard, I don't remember what we had. We had a lot of trucks. There might have been some armored equipment on it too. When we beached, we left them there in Okinawa, and we're on our way back to Guam to pick up another load. We were halfway between Okinawa and Guam one evening when somebody said, it's over. They dropped an atomic bomb, and that went through the ship like water through a strainer. What had happened, we found out that they dropped the atomic bomb, and we knew then that the war would probably be over soon. History can tell you what happened after that. And we went back to Guam, and we were in the harbor at Guam, tied up at a buoy, and we were there for quite a while. What I mean for quite a while, for a couple of weeks. We originally had supposed to load up with more equipment and men to go back to Okinawa, probably for more exercises. We were there for weeks. During the negotiations for peace, apparently part of the peace agreement was that we should return Japanese soldiers who were in China back to Japan. Now, the Japanese occupied certain parts of Japan since the early to mid 1930s, when they invaded China. They had occupied certain areas in Japan. When the war started, they had over 250,000 troops in China. I'm not sure how many they had when the war ended, but Japan lost almost its entire merchant marine and a majority of its navy. They did not have the shipping to return their men to Japan. So part of the peace agreement was we had a lot of ships doing nothing. And so that's what we did. after a few, we might have been in Guam for as long as a month and a half or 2 months running. The final peace agreement was signed, I think, very early in September of 1945 aboard the USS Missouri. I'm not sure of the time frame we had when we left to go to China. We went to a place called Tsingtao. That name had since been changed. In addition to carrying a load of either construction equipment or armored vehicles of any kind, we also had anchored to both sides of the ship square pontoons, which were roughly 8 by 8 by 8, a steel cube. When you line up a bunch of these steel cubes, one after the other, they occupied roughly 1/2 the length of the ship on both sides. They were actually welded to the side of the ship. And the intent of these was when you would grind the welds away and let them drop off, then you would put 2 of them side by side. Now you had a walkway 16 feet wide. And when you would anchor them end to end, you could run them actually armored vehicles off the tank deck of an LSD directly onto one of these anchorages. And in a sense, we carried our own roadways with us. And then in addition to that, they had another craft called an LCT, which was a very small version of an LST. They were less than about the third the length of an LST, roughly 115 feet long. They also carried a small crew. They had a couple of about 3 or 4 men. They had 3 engines that very similar to the ones in our LCVPs, and a very large tank deck. They could carry 4 full-size tanks. They could carry trucks, small vehicles, and that they were like an intermediate size landing craft. And they were sitting up on the main deck on big blocks of wood that were set on the main deck. They lowered the LCT onto the blocks there, then anchored it down with straps that were welded to the deck to keep from losing it. And the way you would launch them is you would fill your ship's ballast tanks on one side to lean the ship in one direction. When you got to the right angle, by cutting all these welds, the ship, the LCT, would slide right off the deck into the water. We are talking about Tsingtao, China. That's where we were going to pick up and return some Japanese soldiers to Japan. And it's 10:15. I'm tired. Make a note.
Let's cut it off.
Make a note. We'll continue next week from this point.